Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into something, well, pretty mind-bending. We're going to be talking about trans philosophy.
Oh, yeah, it's a fascinating area. It really gets you thinking.
It really does. And we're using, as our roadmap for this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on trans philosophy.
It's a really comprehensive overview, really dives deep into the history and the key debates.
Yeah, it's pretty dense, though, a lot to unpack. So what we're aiming to do is kind of pull out the most intriguing and I think the most important ideas, give you a shortcut to understanding, the core of what trans philosophy is all about.
And it's not just about trans issues, as a separate thing. It's about how these experiences of trans people are reshaping how we think about some pretty fundamental ideas in philosophy.
Right, like what even is reality? What makes the person a person? How do we know what we know? Big questions.
Huge questions. And trans philosophy is bringing some really surprising and I think really valuable new perspectives to these questions. So, yeah, buckle up. Get ready to have your assumptions challenged. Okay, so first things first, let's lay some groundwork. What are we even talking about when we say trans?
Right, well, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points to this definition that's common in trans studies. Any movement away from a gender position that was assigned to a person at birth, one that they didn't choose.
Okay, so not just about being trans, but transing in a way?
In a way, yeah, it's more about that movement, that shift. And it encompasses a really broad range of experiences, people who deviate from those typical gender norms and expectations in various ways.
Okay, so right off the bat, as a philosopher, you got to be thinking, hold on, can a term that exists in modern English actually capture this whole spectrum of experiences?
Right. Across all cultures, across all of history. I mean, how do we know what people would have identified as if trans was a category that existed for them?
And then the question of where do we draw that line? I mean, what distinguishes someone who just, I don't know, kind of bends the gender rules a bit from someone who identifies as trans?
Yeah, it gets really blurry. And then there's the even bigger question of what does using the label trans help us to see, and what might it actually obscure?
Ooh, yeah. What are we maybe missing by focusing on that one category?
Exactly. So those are some of the foundational questions that trans philosophy really grapples with. And looking at the history of the term trans itself actually helps us understand some of these complexities even better.
Right, because it's not like it just appeared out of nowhere. It's had its own evolution.
Absolutely. The entry talks about these early gender wars in the 1990s, and it was a very tumultuous time, for trans people, especially within feminist and lesbian spaces.
Yeah, like communities that were supposed to be pushing back against traditional gender roles, but were still having a hard time with trans
Right,
identities.
exactly.
Yeah.
There were a lot of accusations thrown around sometimes, about trans women being men invading women's
And
spaces.
about trans men being like traitors to feminism or something like that.
Yeah, really problematic stuff. And it really shows how deeply embedded this binary thinking about gender was, even among people who are trying to break free from it.
So interesting to think about how those early conflicts really reveal that tension.
They do. They really do.
Yeah.
But it's also important to note that even amidst those conflicts, there were these early queer and trans feminist thinkers who were starting to articulate the shared concerns between, trans people and other folks who are challenging gender norms.
Like finding common ground, even if they didn't always agree on everything.
Right. So there was this recognition that there was something bigger at stake than just the specific labels they were using.
And even within the trans community, there wasn't necessarily this unified understanding of what it meant to be trans.
Definitely not. The 1990s were this time of intense discussion and debate, and the meaning of terms was always being negotiated.
Right, like you had transvestites, transsexuals, and then transgender started to emerge as this kind of umbrella term.
More of a catch-all, yeah.
And the emphasis there was really on self-identification, on how a person lived their life and how they identified, rather than on these strict medical definitions.
So moving away from saying you have to have this surgery or that hormone treatment to be considered truly trans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which was a really important shift. It was about emphasizing that trans experience is really diverse, and it can't be boiled down to these simple checklists.
And it also opened up space for people who didn't necessarily identify with the binary categories of man or woman.
Right, exactly. It was a step towards recognizing that gender isn't just this either-or thing. But the entry also makes this really important point that we have to be careful about applying a term that originated in a very specific U.S. context
To the whole world.
to the whole world, yeah. because it risks overshadowing and even erasing all the other ways that people have understood and expressed gender across different cultures and throughout history.
Right, like it's not the only framework for thinking about gender diversity. Not at all. And we see this really clearly in the relationship between the trans movement and the intersex movement, which it's complicated.
It is, right, because there's some overlap in terms of challenging this binary system of sex and gender, but they're not the same thing.
Definitely not. And some intersex scholars and activists really emphasize the need to keep those experiences distinct.
Like they're both fighting against a rigid system, but they're fighting for different things.
Right. But others point to these shared experiences of medical scrutiny, of having their bodies kind of subject to these norms that they didn't choose.
And the potential for building coalitions.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the entry talks about this idea of coalitional theorizing, which is like, how can we work together?
But while also respecting those differences.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that solidarity requires nuance and careful attention to each group's specific needs and histories.
Okay, so we've got transgender, we've got intersex, then we have the rise of the term cisgender, which is, I guess, meant to describe everyone who's not trans.
Yeah, kind of the flip side of a coin. And it's become pretty widely used now.
It has, yeah. But the entry also points out some pretty significant critiques of the term.
Right, like some people argue that it actually recenters the binary, by creating this other category that's defined in relation to trans.
So instead of questioning the binary itself, we're just kind of reinforcing it by creating these two opposing sides.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of cisgender being seen as the default, the normal way to be.
Which can erase all the complexities of cisgender experience too, right? Like, it's not a monolith.
Absolutely. And it also brings up questions of who gets to claim this identity. Are there certain assumptions built into it about whiteness or class or ability?
Well, like, does everyone who's not trans actually feel like cisgender accurately describes them?
Right, exactly. So it's a term that's become useful in some ways, but we have to be mindful of those potential downsides.
Okay, and then we've got non-binary, which really started gaining momentum in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it's become a much more widely used and recognized term.
It has, yeah. And initially, it was often defined as, like, any gender that's not exclusively male or female, whether someone is trans or not.
Right, so it kind of expands the possibilities beyond that binary, but it also has this interesting relationship with the category of trans.
Right, because it's not always clear where they overlap or diverge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes non-binary has been seen as this more radical rejection of the gender binary, like a step even further beyond the trans binary.
Like, not just moving between 2 points, but kind of breaking the whole line.
Exactly. But the entry also raises this really important point. If we're defining ourselves as just not man and not woman, are we still giving too much power to those categories?
Like, are we still trapped within that framework, even if we're trying to move beyond it?
Exactly. And unfortunately, the way non-binary has been used sometimes has led to some divisions in the broader community of people who are challenging gender norms.
Like almost creating this hierarchy.
Right, like non-binary is more radical than trans or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
which is not helpful, not at all.
And then you have the problem of how even a potentially radical term like non-binary can get co-opted by bureaucratic systems.
Yeah, the bureaucracy always finds a way.
Right. And it ends up solidifying this new, maybe slightly more inclusive, but still very limited 3-tiered gender system.
Yeah, you get your male, your female, and your non-binary checkbox.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, we haven't really challenged the fundamental structure here.
Nope, not at all. And speaking of challenging structures, this whole discussion around decolonizing transgender is so important.
It's crucial because, applying a Western concept to describe gender diversity in other cultures, like we were talking about Hajiyas in South Asia or Two-Spirits in indigenous North American traditions, it can be really problematic.
Like, it risks imposing a Western framework on experiences and identities that have their own very rich and complex histories and meanings.
Exactly. It can be a form of, epistemic colonialism almost.
Right, like imposing our way of knowing on other cultures.
Right. And indigenous perspectives, for example, often have these completely different ways of understanding embodiment in time and belonging that don't fit neatly into the Western trans category.
Like, they might not even have a concept of gender that maps onto our understanding of it.
Right, and we risk losing entire histories and understandings of gender diversity when we try to force everything into this one Western framework.
And even within Western contexts, the meaning and experience of transness can vary widely.
Absolutely. Like, Black trans studies, for instance, makes this really powerful argument that for Black people, Blackness and transness are deeply intertwined in a way that's quite unique.
Because of the history of slavery, right, where Black bodies were already kind of ungendered in a really violent and dehumanizing way.
Exactly. So for Black trans folks, the experience of being trans is shaped by this historical context of racialized gendering.
It almost suggests that gender for Black people has always already been disrupted, in a sense, through the violence of slavery.
Yeah, it's a really profound rethinking of what gender means and how it intersects with race and power.
Then on the other hand, you have Latinx studies, which offer some really interesting critiques of trans as being too Western-centric.
Right? They argue that it can erase the very specific ways that gender is understood in Latin American cultures and even ignore the existing terminology and concepts.
So it's like, again, this reminder that we have to be really careful about assuming that one term can capture the full complexity of gender diversity across all these different contexts.
Absolutely. We have to be attentive to the nuances and the specificities of each culture and its history.
Okay, so one last thing to touch on in terms of this background on trans, the relationship between the trans community and the disability community, which has sometimes been a bit fraught.
Yeah, it's a complicated area
Oh.
because both communities have faced this history of being pathologized, of being seen as somehow abnormal.
Right, and both have fought hard for recognition and for their rights.
Absolutely. But there's been this tension, especially around the idea that transness should be seen as natural and healthy.
Which, while it's understandable because people want to move away from that stigma, it can unintentionally exclude the experiences of trans people who also have disability.
Right. It can create this kind of unspoken expectation that to be truly trans, you have to be mentally and physically healthy.
Which is really problematic, and it ignores the fact that there's a lot of overlap between the two communities.
Exactly. And the entry talks about this idea of how both trans people and disabled people have been subjected to this kind of intense medical scrutiny.
Right, and often told what's wrong with them and how they need to be fixed.
Exactly. So there's a lot of shared ground there in terms of fighting for bodily autonomy and for the right to define their own identities and experiences.
And it's led to some really interesting developments, like the emergence of terms like autogender and neurogender.
Which is really cool because it's recognizing the specific ways that neurodiversity can intersect with gender identity.
So it's like another step towards breaking down those rigid categories and acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience.
Absolutely. It's about creating space for everyone and recognizing that there's no one right way to be trans or to be disabled.
Okay, so with all of that really rich and complex background as our starting point, let's finally dive into the big question. What is trans philosophy?
All right, well, at its core, trans philosophy is philosophical work that's accountable to the experiences, the histories, the cultural productions, and the politics of trans people.
So it's not just about trans people, it's also for them.
Absolutely. It's rooted in trans lives, and the ways trans people make meaning in a world that's often hostile to them.
And the entry emphasizes that it's not just about philosophers kind of studying trans issues from a distance.
No, not at all. It's about engaging in philosophy from and with trans lives. So recognizing trans people as thinkers and theorists themselves.
Right, like they're not just the objects of study, they're also the ones doing the studying.
Exactly. And it stands in such stark contrast to those approaches that treat trans life as this, abstract puzzle to be solved.
Like, oh, let's analyze this strange phenomenon over here.
Right. Or approaches that completely ignore trans voices and histories.
Yeah, we can figure this out without actually talking to any trans people.
Yeah, exactly. Trans philosophy is like, no, we can't. And it also pushes back against using philosophy to justify trans exclusionary views.
Like trying to find philosophical reasons why trans people shouldn't have rights or shouldn't be recognized.
Right, like trying to use logic to dehumanize people.
Yeah.
And trans philosophy is like, absolutely not, we're not going to do that.
But it's situated within this broader lineage of philosophies of difference, like Africana philosophy, feminist philosophy, indigenous philosophy.
Yeah, drawing on all of those insights about embodiment, identity, oppression, and resistance, it's all connected.
So it's recognizing that these struggles are not isolated. They're part of this larger fight for social justice.
Exactly. And trans philosophy learns from those other fields, but also brings its own unique perspectives to the table.
Right, because it's not just copying what other movements have done, it's bringing something new to the conversation.
Absolutely. And the entry describes trans philosophy as this critical project. So it's constantly analyzing, like, What are the conditions that make trans experience possible?
Questioning those taken for granted assumptions.
Yeah, like what are the social institutions that shape our understanding of gender? What are the power structures at play?
And it's also being reflexive,
Yeah.
like turning that critical lens back on itself and questioning its own assumptions and biases.
Which is so important because no field of inquiry is perfect. We always have to be interrogating our own
Right,
frameworks.
like where are our blind spots? What are we missing? How can we do better?
Exactly. And one of the key aspects of this critical approach is what the entry calls experiential critique.
Okay, what does that mean?
So it's about resisting this tendency to turn trans people into, objects of curiosity or to erase the complexity of their lives.
Like simplifying their experiences to fit into some pre-existing narrative.
Exactly. And there are these two specific concepts that the entry highlights: curiatization and spectacle erasure formation.
Those are some big words.
They are, but they're really powerful ideas. So curiatization is when trans people are treated like these interesting specimens to be studied.
Like, ooh, look at the trans person. Let's learn about their exotic life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's often for the benefit of cisgender audiences. It's not actually about understanding trans people on their own terms.
It's like turning them into entertainment almost.
Right. And then spectacle erasure is how that focus on the sensational aspects of being trans can actually lead to the erasure of their everyday lives and experiences.
And like we get so caught up in the spectacle that we forget about the real people behind it.
Exactly. And trans philosophy is really trying to push back against both of those tendencies.
By centering trans people's own voices and perspectives.
Absolutely. It's about saying, let's listen to what trans people have to say about their own lives and experiences, and let's take their perspective seriously.
And that leads us to the relationship between trans philosophy and feminism, which has, had its ups and downs.
It's a complicated relationship for sure. But the entry points out that trans philosophy is inherently feminist in a lot of ways.
Because of its commitment to gender justice, right? And because there's so much overlap in the communities.
Exactly. They're fighting for a lot of the same things.
Yeah.
But there's also this history of tension. And obviously, the most glaring example is the rise of trans-exclusionary radical feminism, or TERFism.
Which, unfortunately, is still around.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But within feminist thought, the concept of transfeminism is really important. It's about bringing those trans perspectives to feminist issues, advocating specifically for trans women's liberation.
And building a more inclusive feminist movement.
Right, one that fights for the rights and well-being of all gender minorities. And key terms here are things like intersectionality.
Which is about how different forms of oppression overlap and intersect.
Right, so not just looking at gender, but also race, class, ability, all of those things.
And then transmisogyny, which is that specific blend of transphobia and misogyny that trans women face.
Right, and then transmasculinity, which has also become a really important area of focus within transfeminism.
Okay, so moving on from feminism, we get to trans epistemology, which I think is a really fascinating area.
It is, yeah. It's basically about how trans communities face these very specific forms of injustice when it comes to knowledge and knowing.
Like, they're not just excluded from knowledge, but also from the very process of creating and sharing knowledge,
Exactly. So things like testimonial injustice.
where a trans person's word isn't taken seriously simply because they're trans.
Right, like their testimony is automatically deemed less credible.
And then hermeneutic injustice, which is this idea that the dominant ways of understanding the world don't even have the concepts to make sense of trans experiences.
Yeah, like there's not even the language to articulate what it's like to be trans, so those experiences are kind of silenced or dismissed.
And trans epistemology really tries to address those injustices by saying, we need to listen to trans people.
Right, like their voices and their perspectives are valuable sources of knowledge.
And it also goes beyond just identifying those injustices to explore what it calls positive trans epistemology.
Yeah, which is more about like how do trans communities actually create knowledge? What are their unique ways of knowing?
So it's not just about being victims of epistemic injustice, it's also about being active creators of knowledge.
Exactly. And one example is this concept of the transordinary, which is all about how the everyday experiences of trans people can offer these really profound insights into gender.
Like by living their lives, they're challenging those taken for granted assumptions about what gender is and how it works.
Right. And just the very fact that trans people exist, disrupts those traditional gender categories and creates new ways of understanding gender.
It forces everyone to rethink their assumptions, whether they realize it or not.
Exactly. And the entry also talks about how trans people have often been at the forefront of generating new language and concepts around gender.
Like cisgender is a term that originated within the trans community, right?
Right, so trans people aren't just passively receiving knowledge, they're actively shaping the way we think about gender.
Which is so cool. But the entry also rightly points out that trans epistemology needs to be self-critical. It needs to address those internal issues of trans misogyny, ableism, racism.
Right, because no community is perfect,
Yeah.
and there can be these hierarchies and power dynamics at play within any group.
So it's about being aware of those potential blind spots and
Yeah.
making sure that trans epistemology is truly inclusive and accountable to all trans people.
Absolutely. And then we have trans phenomenology, which really dives into the lived experience of being trans.
So what it actually feels like to be trans on a very embodied level.
Exactly. It focuses on things like trans embodiment, the experience of gender dysphoria, and how those things shape our perception of the world.
So drawing on classical phenomenology, which is this whole branch of philosophy that studies consciousness and experience,
Right, but also feminist phenomenology, queer phenomenology.
bringing in those perspectives that center the body and the lived experience.
Absolutely. And one of the key things that trans phenomenology explores is the relationship between the physical body and what's called the felt body or the lived body.
So the way we experience our bodies might not always align with our physical anatomy.
Right, and that's especially relevant for trans people, who might feel like their body doesn't match their gender identity.
And the entry mentions some interesting analytical distinctions like corporeal body versus felt body and being there versus being with.
It can get a bit technical, but basically it's about unpacking all the different layers of experience.
And then there's critical phenomenology, which takes it a step further by examining how things like transphobia and social stigma actually shape those lived experiences.
Right, so it's not just about individual experience, it's also about how those experiences are shaped by these external forces.
Like, how does living in a transphobic world affect how a trans person experiences their own body?
Exactly. And it also looks at trans resistance, how trans people are actively fighting back against those forces.
And it's not just about trans men and trans women. It also looks at the experiences of agender people, trans people of color.
Right, and trans people with disabilities.
So it's really trying to capture the full diversity of trans experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it even extends to these broader questions of home and homelessness.
Like, what does it mean to feel at home in your body, in your community, in the world?
Yeah, really deep stuff. And then we move on to trans history, trans story, which emphasizes the resistance to the simplistic trans narrative.
Like the idea that there's one single path that all trans people follow.
Right, which is obviously not true at all. And so instead of focusing on this one narrative, trans history and trans storytelling is about uncovering all the complex and often unsteady ways that people experience transing their gender.
And it's also about challenging this tendency to focus on the U.S. context, as if that's the only place where trans history exists.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the entry talks about how we need to think about archives differently. Where are we looking for trans history?
And how do we tell those stories in a way that honors their complexity?
Exactly. And it raises questions about origin stories. Like where did the idea of transgender come from? And how does that origin story shape our understanding of it today?
And how can we think about the present differently by looking at the past in a more nuanced way?
Right. And it gives examples of all these different aspects of trans history, like economic precarity, the impact of biopolitical technologies, white neoliberalism.
And the ways that blackness and transness intersect, and indigenous two-spirit concepts, and even medieval gender diversity.
So it's really broadening our understanding of what trans history can encompass.
And finally, we get to trans metaphysics, which is where it gets really philosophical.
This is where we're getting into the big questions, the nature of reality, the nature of identity.
And it's about establishing the realness of transness in a world that often denies it.
Yeah, like trying to find a philosophical grounding for saying trans people are real, their experiences are valid, and their identities are legitimate.
And a big question here is, what is gender anyway?
Right, and trans philosophy is challenging all these traditional assumptions about gender and identity.
Like, is gender about biology? Is it about social roles? Is it something we choose?
And it's really rewiring our understanding of ontology, which is like, what does it mean for something to exist?
Right. And what does it mean for something to be real?
Exactly. And the entry talks about all these different theories of gender that philosophers have put forward.
Like, some people say gender is this cluster of characteristics. Others say it's a social category. Others say it's something internal, something we feel.
And there's this ongoing debate between externalist accounts of gender and internalist accounts.
Like, is it about how the world sees us, or is it about how we see ourselves?
Right. And then there are all these different kinds of gender, critical gender kinds, hegemonic gender kinds, identity gender kinds.
It's a lot to keep track of, but it's really interesting to see how trans philosophy is pushing those boundaries and coming up with new ways to think about these really fundamental concepts.
Absolutely. And one of the key critiques that comes up is that the whole idea of gender identity might actually be kind of cisnormative.
Like, it assumes that everyone has this stable internal sense of their gender, which might not be true for everyone.
Right. And some people argue that instead of focusing on gender identity, we should be thinking about how gender functions in a more social and relational way.
So, less about what's going on inside us and more about how gender is used to organize social space and relationships.
Exactly. It's a really different way of thinking about it. And it just shows how much trans philosophy is pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
Okay, so we've talked about experiential critique, which is all about centering the lived experiences of trans people.
Right. And that's crucial. But the entry also makes it clear that we need to go beyond that and look at the bigger picture.
Which is where institutional critique comes in.
Right. It's about understanding how those larger social structures and institutions shape individual experiences within this cis-heteronormative world.
So, not just looking at how individuals experience transphobia, but looking at the systems that perpetuate that transphobia.
Exactly. And this is where we start to see the focus on things like colonialism, medicalization, capitalism, the legal system.
All those forces that can either support or oppress trans people.
Absolutely. And there's this idea of critical trans politics, which is about not just seeking inclusion within existing systems, but actually trying to transform those systems.
Like, not just asking for a seat at the table, but building a new table altogether.
Exactly. And one of the key areas here is the coloniality of gender, which draws on the work of Maria Lugones.
Who argues that this Western binary gender system wasn't just something that developed naturally, it was actively imposed through colonialism.
Right. And colonizers often attributed sex to colonized people, male or female, but they denied them gender.
Like, they didn't see them as having the capacity for proper gender expression.
Right. Which raises these huge questions about the very definition of gender.
Yeah.
And where this idea of a strict binary actually came from.
And how that colonial history continues to shape our understanding of gender today.
Absolutely. And it also makes us think about, like, is transgender itself a colonial concept?
Like, are we imposing a Western framework on other cultures when we use that term?
Exactly. And how do trans, two-spirit, and other gender variant people fit into this colonial history, both as victims and as resistors?
So it's really challenging us to rethink those basic assumptions about gender and where they come from.
And then there's the medicalization of gender, which is all about how the medical establishment has historically had so much control over trans lives.
Like, who gets to transition and how they do it.
Right. It's this gatekeeping function.
Yep.
And it critiques this pathologizing language that's often used, gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria.
Like, there's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed.
Exactly. And it also looks at how medical professionals can sometimes enforce these very narrow and normative ideas about what it means to be trans.
Like, you have to fit into this very specific box to be considered legitimate.
Right. And so trans philosophy is pushing back against that and highlighting all the non-normative ways of understanding trans subjectivity.
Like, thinking about trans people as cyborgs, as monsters, as hybrids.
Yeah, those are some really interesting metaphors. And it also looks at things like DIY approaches to transition and the emergence of new gender terms that refuse to be categorized by the medical establishment.
So it's about reclaiming that power and defining yourself on your own terms.
Absolutely. And then we get to trans Marxism and materialism, which brings together trans theory and Marxist political analysis.
So looking at how economic systems, particularly capitalism, intersect with the experiences of trans people.
Right. It's about that material reality of being trans in a capitalist world.
And it highlights issues like economic insecurity, discrimination in the workplace, poverty, incarceration.
Right. All these material conditions that disproportionately affect trans people.
And it also draws on the work of philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari, who have these really interesting ideas about the fluidity of the body and how we can think about gender in more fluid and less binary ways.
Yeah, they're talking about these processes of deterritorialization, how we can kind of break free from those fixed categories that society imposes on us.
And it's not just about analyzing the problem, it's also about imagining those possibilities for liberation.
Right, like what would a truly trans-liberated world look like and how can we get there?
And then, of course, we have to talk about transphobia and trans necropolitics, which is, the very real violence that trans people face.
Yeah, this is where it gets really heavy. But it's important to acknowledge that transphobia isn't just individual prejudice, it's also these systemic structures that cause harm.
And the entry talks about the trap of trans visibility, this idea that becoming more visible will automatically lead to greater acceptance.
Which unfortunately isn't always the case. And in fact, sometimes increased visibility can lead to increased surveillance and violence, especially for trans people of color.
And so the concept of a trans right to opacity comes up here.
Which is the right to not be fully knowable or legible to those dominant power structures.
Like you don't have to explain yourself or justify your existence to anyone.
Exactly. You have the right to be opaque, to be complex, to be a mystery.
And then finally, under institutional critique, we have issues of law and policy, which looks at how legal systems interact with trans lives.
And often, those legal systems are set up in a way that reinforces those existing norms around sex and gender.
And while there have been some advancements in terms of trans rights, the entry also points out the potential pitfalls of some of those legal changes.
Like the risk of creating a new kind of trans normativity, even within seemingly progressive policies.
Right, like if the law says you have to fit into one of these 3 boxes, male, female, or non-binary, that's still excluding a lot of people.
Exactly. So it's not just about changing the law, it's also about changing hearts and minds.
And building those supportive communities that can provide care and solidarity outside of those legal frameworks.
Absolutely. And then we have trans ecology, which is a really fascinating area that connects trans discourse with environmental philosophy and new materialism.
It's like taking trans beyond the realm of human gender and applying it to the whole natural world.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. And